So I would like to welcome to the stage Ella Rhodes.
Thank you, Michael. That was very, very kind, and very kind of the BPS to come and ask me to talk. I suppose because I work for them, they sort of had to, but it's nice nonetheless. I've been really, really excited to come here. I've reported on this event, obviously, as a journalist for the last few years, and it's one of those events where everybody leaves with this sense of real motivation, and I really hope that you leave today feeling that, because it's fantastic. So today I've got kind of three broad aims, none of which I'm really going to meet that directly probably, but I want to show you, I mean, you all know the value of a psychology degree, I'm sure, but I just want to show you that there's value in a psychology degree beyond what you might have already considered. Training for a journalist to be a journalist is just one of those things, but there's many more career options that psychologists are really suited for. I think journalism is one of them. And anybody in the audience who has a love of writing or has a desire to get better at writing, I'd like to encourage you, again, kind of indirectly, that it's a vital skill, it's a brilliant skill, and especially for any of you who are kind of definitely going into academia in the future. It's a great thing to be able to write for wider audiences, spread the word about your work and others' work. It's a great thing to be able to do. And also any of you who are going into academia or into clinical practice, as Michael said, I'm going to have a few tips at the end for some of the ways you can do that as well. When I was putting this together, this presentation together, my career path looks so linear, so well planned, but I just want to emphasise to you all that it just completely was not. So much of what I've done has been based on really spontaneous, possibly not that well-informed decisions, I've started things and failed them, and I've started things and finished them. So I had a gap year after I'd finished my A-levels, and I started a drama degree, as you do. I found myself standing in a room full of people pretending to be trees and just kind of thought, nah, it's not for me. Not to do down the arts at all, because obviously fantastic, but so I took another gap year and I worked in a hospital laboratory, again, of course, with my best friend, which was quite a lot of fun, and then went to the University of Birmingham finally to do my psychology BSc. I've been kind of convinced by my stepsister, actually, who was doing her doctorate. She kind of was telling me what psychology was like, and I'd always been fascinated by humans. I'd loved my A-level, and I initially kind of wanted to go on and help people somehow, which I'm sure is a view shared by many of you. So while I was at Birmingham, I sort of dabbled in research a little bit. I did a summer research assistant placement with Ian Apley, the developmental psychologist in Birmingham, which was really interesting. And then I did my third year project in psychophysics, and that was the final straw for me. And I just thought, nope, research is absolutely not for me, forget it. Which, while I'm talking about third year projects, if any of you still haven't chosen, or if you get a choice, do try and choose something that really, really speaks to you, because, you spend a long time doing it. And another thing to say on that, I do think now, looking back, had I had a little bit more confidence in my abilities research-wise, and if I'd, stuck with it a little bit longer, I kind of think probably I would have been absolutely fine in research. But, so if you're kind of feeling a little bit like that at the moment, just look at the evidence. Are you doing okay? If you are, stick with it, see what happens. I moved back to my hometown in Derby after I'd finished my degree, and I was just awfully confused for a while. And I had a friend who worked at our local newspaper, the Derby Telegraph, and she would come to my house and we'd drink orange squash, and she'd tell me about all the, amazing, varied, bizarre, interesting things that she did. And I'd always loved writing, and it just kind of clicked, and I thought, well, I'll just sort of give it a try then. So rather spontaneously, I signed up for the postgraduate diploma in newspaper journalism at Nottingham Trent University. And I was so out of my depth. It's ridiculous. I felt just utterly kind of overwhelmed by it, because on this course, and it's a really, really brilliant course, this one. I think it's got a different name now, but similar sort of thing. You're treated very, very much like a working journalist. It lasts for 1 academic year, and you're given a patch within the city. So I was given a town kind of between Derby and Nottingham to cover. So that was where I'd go to source contacts and to source stories. You just kind of try and get to know the local people, what's going on, what the issues are, and that's kind of how you source a lot of stories anyway. So I did all that, and then the kind of other modules you do include things like media law, which is absolutely fascinating. We had an excellent lecturer teaching us this who told us so many like fascinating case studies and things like that. So you cover things like libel and defamation law, copyright law, and all this kind of stuff that I'd never even considered. And you also look at politics, public affairs. So you study kind of the functioning of the European governments, central governments and local governments. Again, something I was really quite shamefully ignorant of before I started this course. And it just really opens your mind to sort of how society functions. You do a little bit of ethics, try not to laugh too hard. Journalists do have ethics. Shorthand as well. For any of you who don't know, shorthand's kind of the quick way of writing that journalists use in courts and places that you can't take recorders. And I really meant to give you an example of this on my slides and completely forgot, but if anybody wants their name writing in shorthand, I can do that for you. I also did a sort of an online journalism course. So I did my final online project. It was just a feature and a video that were published online on the revival of folk music, which kind of cemented my persona as the sort of hippie of the group, and that's never left me since. So throughout that whole time that I was doing my postgraduate diploma, I'd been also doing work experience at the Derby Telegraph, my local paper. And yeah, just been kind of doing it weekends and whenever I could. And finally, when I passed all my media law and shorthand exams and all of that, I was offered to apply for a job there. So yeah, I got the job at the Derby Telegraph, which, as I say, is a local daily newspaper. I think it used to have a circulation of around 20,000, something like that. And when you first become a journalist at a publication, for the first 18 months to 2 years, you're working towards your national qualification in journalism. So for those first 2 years, you're classed as a trainee reporter. And you're trying to kind of build up a portfolio to submit for this national qualification of journalism at the end. So, and you have to kind of fill certain categories within that portfolio. So you need kind of 5 business stories, 10 charity stories, or whatever it is. So you cover everything. I mean, I've got a few examples of the sorts of things that I did while I was there, but again, I was given a patch, this time a lot bigger, one of the larger boroughs to the north of Derbyshire, Amber Valley. So I'd go up to Amber Valley for council meetings, planning meetings, protests, anything. If somebody from Amber Valley died, I'd be the most likely person to write their obituary. That kind of thing. Anyone in court who was from Amber Valley, that would be my responsibility. I was also beer and animal correspondent, because of course I was, come on. So that meant a lot of going to beer festivals and RSPCA and stuff and writing stories about cute animals, which is way more up my street than any of the other stuff, really. The courts, yeah, you cover sort of all of the courts when you're a trainee. So I went to Crown Court quite a lot, which is kind of the more serious crimes, magistrates for lesser crimes. And I also went to Coroner's Court a fair bit and covered inquests. So for anyone who doesn't know, an inquest most often is used to determine kind of the circumstances around somebody's death. If they've died suddenly or unexpectedly, very, very young, they are really horrendous for the families who have to go through them. But the thing you might not know about inquests is that they're also used to determine whether something is treasure. So imagine you're digging in a field, if you will, and you come across a hoard of Roman coins. By law, you have to report that find within 14 days. It's sent off to experts at like the British Museum or wherever, and they analyse it for its content of precious metal. And then you come back to an inquest to be told whether your stuff is treasure. So there'd be some days I'd be in coroner's court all day, you know, death and destruction all morning. Everybody's just, you know, it's awful. And then after lunch, you'd have a happy metal detectorist just sauntering in, coming to find out if he'd found some treasure. And it's just all very weird. And I think, the more I kind of studied law and politics, the more I realised just the ridiculous, antiquated things we still do in this country. It's absolutely bizarre and also really fascinating. Another thing, I mean, I'm sure you'll all know, local journalists are sent out to scenes of murders and scenes of crimes and disasters, small disasters in Derby's case. So there was an evening I was working the late shift at the Derby Telegraph, and that meant it was only me and an editor there, and a photographer as well. And the biggest kind of conference centre in Derby caught on fire, the assembly rooms, and it was only me there. But the sort of amazing camaraderie of a newsroom really came into force that night, because I saw this. You could see the smoke in the distance from the newsroom, and I thought, oh, good. By the way, nobody died or was injured in this fire. It was. And then all of a sudden, every single reporter came flooding back into the newsroom, and we were covering it online and in print, and that was a really exciting time. And the editor bought us pizza at the end, so it was pretty good. So I've got a few of my splashes here, or scoops. They're not really. Just to give you an example of some of the weirdness that you cover, really, as a local journalist. I'm still holding out hope for this. You know, we can keep our fingers crossed. I think they might be our only hope for now. So we'll see. And also this decline of Derbyshire's moth population down to weather and farming. And actually funny, I'm showing you this for comic effect, but this guy I spoke to, this entomologist I interviewed for this story, was one of the most fascinating interviewees I'd ever interviewed. He was just really passionate and really, really interested in moths. He made me love moths, you know, we all love moths. And we got a press release one day about a little blind cat called George who needed adopting, and we were asked to write a story about him, so I adopted him, of course. Look, thank you. I know, he's pretty swell. And he's almost 6 now. So yeah, again, carrying on this kind of theme of making quite off-the-cuff decisions and doing them in very little time, I was sent a link to the job ad at the Psychologist half an hour before the deadline to apply. And obviously it's quite relevant. I had a psychology degree and a journalism qualification, so I thought, yeah, I need to do this job. So I very quickly updated my CV, wrote a covering letter, did all that stuff, and amazingly got an interview. And during that interview, my editor John said to me, he was like, "Have you trained to be a journalist then? Because you've missed off one of your qualifications." I'd missed off my main journalism qualification, and he hired me still. I have actually done it. I just forgot to write it down. For anybody who doesn't know, the Psychologist is the monthly publication of the British Psychological Society, and it goes out to our 50,000-ish members in print and 150,000 online readers every month. The BPS started publishing The Psychologist in 1988, so it celebrates its 30th birthday next year, and as do I. And we feature a whole range of things, but the kind of standard things are letters, news, our features by members, lots of interviews, reviews. We also do kind of a history of psychology section and a psychology of history section called Looking Back, which is really interesting. And early this year we redesigned the magazine and published. It looks more like this now. It's kind of a little bit squatter. We relaunched our website not that long ago, and we also have a really good app. The app is free to download, and if you're a member already, you can access everything on there anyway. But we also put out quite a lot of free collections of articles and features. So if it's Christmas, we'll put out a load of Christmassy things that you can download and read, which is really good. now is the perfect time to encourage you to join the BPS if you haven't already. It's a really great organisation. Having worked especially with the postgraduate affairs group, PsyPag, there's an absolutely brilliant group to join if you're going into postgraduate study. They're really, really on it, and they're really welcoming, and they have a really fantastic conference every year as well, which I go to every single year, really. And we also have the Research Digest. Are any of you familiar with that? The Research Digest blog. That's the it's kind of an offshoot written by Christian Jarrett and co. And they cover kind of research, but for wider audiences. So they digest research down into nice bite-sized articles. The Digest also has a really good app and a podcast as well called Psych and the most recent episode on procrastination is really, really worth a listen if you like your podcasts. Now, a lot of people ask me what my day-to-day work looks like. Not always in an accusatory way. What do you do every day? But it's incredibly varied. These are kind of four of my main sort of things, I suppose. So I do the 8 news pages that we have in the magazine every month, which involves lots of research, lots of interviews, and kind of just trying to keep in touch with current affairs. If there's a story in the news that we can interview psychologists about or give it a psychological slant, those are my kind of favourite sorts of features to write. So recently I've written things on terrorism and the psychology of terrorists and kind of responses to mass shootings and things like that. And I also write longer form features which bring together sort of the evidence around an area and also feature lots of interviews as well. I quite like doing interviews. My first ever feature for The Psychologist was about boredom because I get bored really, really easily. And I think that's kind of something I wanted to highlight was there's the kind of freedom I have as a journalist at The Psychologist. If I have an idea that my editor thinks sounds relatively interesting, I'm given quite a lot of freedom to explore that. And the feature I wrote on superstitions was a good example of that. It gave me the chance to explore the folklore and the history behind superstitions as well as the psychology, which was just really, really fascinating. And I'm also working on a really massive feature, really, really, really long feature about cities of the future and how psychologists can be involved with designing cities in the future to make sure they're healthier and better places for people. So look out for that in April sort of time, hopefully, fingers crossed, I get that done. And since starting at The Psychologist, we've begun publishing a series of guides. I don't know if any of you have seen any of these, but they're kind of pull-out pamphlets in the middle of the magazine, which all they are is 10 evidence-based tips around a certain area. So I've done these on babies, healthy living, university life, and leadership. And thanks to our lovely editorial assistant, Debbie, who's here today, the babies guide was picked up by Mothercare, and they commissioned a reprint to give the guides out at their in-store events. So that was really, really exciting for me. I go to a lot of conferences, just like this, longer conferences, and I've been to a couple abroad as well. And they're great, obviously, to report on the talks that are going on, but also you have a sort of captive group of psychologists to interview and to, potentially work with on future stories. So they're always a brilliant event, really productive, and yeah. Now, life as a journalist. So being a journalist is fascinating every day, I think. Every single day I could be working on something completely new. I'm constantly speaking to absolutely inspirational, fascinating people. And I think because you're speaking to such a range of people about such a range of subjects, you do become a little bit of a jack of all trades. But I quite like that. I quite like hearing a really diverse set of opinions and viewpoints. And it's probably the most enjoyable part of it for me, that I don't really know what to expect most days when I go in. Stress is well, I'm sure your stereotypical view of a journalist is a stressed person, and you would be right. They are stressed people. I mean, I think a lot of this applies much more when you're working at newspapers, especially a daily. when you have kind of multiple deadlines a day, sometimes as short as half an hour to write a whole news story, and that happens constantly. It doesn't stop. And actually, as I was writing this, I was thinking life as an academic is pretty much the same as this, but the deadlines, the constant nature of the deadlines can be quite trying. Working with editors as well is a really fun one. My editor at the moment, John Sutton, he likes to give me really vague briefs for the features he'd like me to write. So the other day he approached me and he said, Ella, I want you to write a feature about the night. And I thought, brilliant, fine. There's tons in psychology about sleep and dreaming. Obviously, we all know that. Lots and lots of stuff about insomnia. And he said to me, no, you can't mention sleep. It's like, okay. Not sure quite how I'm going to do that, but fine. So yeah, that's another thing. And the emotional stress as well came as a real shock to me, I think, working as a local news journalist again, really particularly. You do come into contact with, the grieving and the struggling in society, and those who are, sadly at the bottom of, the ladder. And it's something I didn't really expect and probably wasn't that prepared for. But again, like I say, none of these things really have to be a given in journalism. These days, there is so much more scope for working remotely and, for working to your own times, really. I work from home a few days a week. Christian, who writes the Research Digest, works from home all the time. So if any of this is interesting you and you're thinking, oh, hey, maybe I could do that, none of the stress, none of that stuff needs to be a given at all. And of course, as a journalist, you're learning constantly, and that's something I absolutely love about it. So if any of you are interested in training to be a journalist, the postgraduate courses that are available are usually master's or postgraduate diplomas. And the only difference between those really is that the master's is more expensive and you have to write a thesis, and the postgraduate diploma you don't. The master's is also a bit better if you'd like to go into teaching, I've heard. If you're looking for courses, make sure they're accredited by the NCTJ, the National Council for the Training of Journalists. And there are fast-track courses available too, which only take 16 weeks. I don't know that much about those. They sound slightly terrifying to me, but it's very quick, so it might be painless. The only the way that you get onto one of these postgraduate courses, usually all you need is a 2:1 degree and to be able to write. And when I say be able to write, I mean be able to write coherently. They are very, very much expecting you to not be able to write like a journalist when you start a postgraduate diploma in journalism. They don't expect you to have those skills. So as long as you can, write clearly, which I'm sure all of you can, it's a real possibility. And so many of the journalists I knew, especially at the Derby Telegraph, came from a ridiculous range of backgrounds. I wasn't the weird one having a psychology degree. Actually, there were, history graduates there, arts graduates, and who'd all kind of had a change of career track. So yeah, it's actually quite a diverse field, really, quite surprisingly so, I always thought. And journalism in itself opens a lot of doors. I forgot to mention on the last slide, but there are specific science journalism courses as well, which are very worth looking into if you're interested. And the Association of British Science Writers is a brilliant organisation that runs really fab conferences once every 2 years. There's things like medical writing as well that you can get into via science and via journalism, which involve writing about drugs and treatments for wider audiences like NICE and the public. Communications and PR, every kind of big institution has a press office, and press officers work with journalists who have queries about that organisation. And press officers also put out news stories about a particular organisation for journalists to use as well. I also wanted to talk a little bit about freelance journalism, because while freelancing is something that most journalists would go into quite a lot later, I think, in their careers, once you've got a good network of contacts, etc., established, But it's very, very possible for academics and clinicians to do this. In fact, it's a really fantastic thing to do if you're an academic or a clinician. There's a huge appetite for psychology in the media. And I can guarantee, once you're all qualified and working, if you contact journalists and say, I'm an expert, I want to write a story or want to contribute to a story on whatever, they will bite your hand off probably because, it's a very rare thing. Journalists are very time stretched. So, you can really put your name out there if you want to, I think. I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the really brilliant academics who work full-time but also sort of work with the media or write for wider audiences as well. I don't know if you know the blog Mind Hacks by Vaughan Bell and Tom Stafford, but that's absolutely brilliant. There's people like Jay Watts, who writes for The Independent. She's a big advocate for, mental health. Susie Gage, another fantastic person in psychology who does the podcast Say Why to Drugs, which is takes kind of all the evidence around recreational drugs and presents it in a sort of non-hysterical, scientific way, but for wide audiences. And people like Catherine Loveday and Sophie Scott are just excellent at, getting out there and talking about psychology to radio stations, TV or wherever. And Sophie Scott's doing the Royal Institution Christmas lectures this year, so that's going to be brilliant. And if you haven't ever seen her TED talk on laughter, I very highly recommend it. Now, for any of you who are going to go into academia or become a clinician in the future, here's a few kind of little tips. Now, blogs. There's a lot of psychology blogs out there, I'm sure you all know. And if you wanted to start a blog, it could very easily feel like you were shouting into the void a little bit at first. But I really think there's still a lot of appetite for psychology, and there's still a lot of scope there. If you find kind of an area that has been underwritten about, or find a creative way to present that material, I think you can easily sort of get your name out there that way. Social media, you probably all know better than me how good social media is for academics, but I wanted to draw your attention to Twitter particularly. Twitter is great for journalists for finding stories, but it's also got a really, really active academic network. I found Twitter so useful for doing things like, say I'm going to a conference and there's going to be someone there I quite fancy interviewing. I can tweet to them first and just introduce myself, and it just breaks the ice. Immediately you can approach them at the conference and just say, oh yeah, we spoke on Twitter, and then move on. And it's just a handy tool for that. But it's also a really handy tool to connect with those networks and spread your research and your work that way. And now the BPS also has a press office database, which if you're a chartered psychologist, so a little bit further down the line, or if you're, have quite a lot of expertise or experience in an area, you can be put on this database. So if a journalist rings and says, I want to speak to a psychologist about terrorism, they'll be able to look you up and recommend you. Sorry about that. And the career and personal development section of the BPS also does media training. So if you're going to be involved with documentaries or be interviewed by a newspaper journalist, for example, that's really good for just kind of telling you how to do that best. And now, finally, a few things I've picked up from my time in journalism. And now I don't feel like I'm really in any position to offer any of you advice, but these are just things which I'm still learning and which have helped me a lot. So, asking questions. I can't emphasize this enough. If you meet somebody you admire, or you meet somebody you're just dying to know more about, ask them. I've never, ever come across, I know I'm a journalist, but I've never come across an expert or an academic who has just refused to talk to me or anything of the nature. People are always so happy to, encourage and support younger generations of psychologists or upcoming generations of psychologists. And one thing I've learned from journalism as well is to not fear looking incredibly stupid. I used to torture myself going through interviews with MPs or various people, and the whole time not truly understanding what they were saying, but also being too terrified to say, what are you talking about? I'd come to write the story and, of course, would have no idea what I was going on about, so I'd have to ring them back. So it's just become my way of working now. When something is just completely not clear, I just say, what are you on about? What are you talking about? It makes life easier. It makes things get done quicker, and it can open up some really interesting conversations too. Be brave, be bold. Life is always going to be a wee bit terrifying now and again. But really those moments when you can look fear in the face and do something regardless, those are the moments that shape you, and those are the times that you'll look back on and think, I'm just so glad I did that. I saw a really good piece of advice on Reddit the other day, of all places, which said you should aim to get rejected at least once a day. And I don't mean this in any kind of like picking people up sense. I just mean, let's talk more like journals or whatever. So, submitting your paper to Nature or whatever it might be for you. I think that taking that view of attempting to get rejected will just make sure you aim as high as possible, and you might be very, very surprised with the amount of things you can't get rejected from, no matter how hard you try. And finally, questioning authority. Now, obviously, this is kind of the mainstay of journalism, is questioning the power structures around you. And I think that's so important, especially for academics. I think recently we've seen a bit of a revolution in psychology. The way people are practicing and the things people are doing are changing for the better. And that's only happened because some very brave people have been able to stand up and say, we're doing this wrong. And it's a big thing to do. But I think those people who do that and do stand up and say, just because this is the status quo doesn't mean it should be the status quo. They're the people who go on to do, really good, really interesting things. So that brings me to an end. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you.